I was wrong about her. And before I tell you how I found out, do me a small favor. If stories about quiet betrayal and the kind of justice that doesn't shout interest you, tap subscribe to Hollow Tales and leave a like. It helps an old bloke like me keep telling these stories. And trust me, this one is worth your time. My name is Edmund Whitcombe. I'm 67 years old, and until 8 months ago I lived in a weatherboard house on the outskirts of Greytown, in the Wairarapa, with my wife of 39 years. Her name was Margaret. Maggie, I called her, ever since the night we met at a barn dance in Carterton in 1986. I was a young surveyor then, fresh out of Massey, with mud on my boots and a borrowed jacket. She was the prettiest woman in the room, and she laughed at one of my jokes that wasn't even funny. I told myself that night I would marry her. 2 years later I did. We had 2 boys. Louis, our eldest, lives in Wellington now. He's a paramedic. Quiet, like his old man. The younger one, Daniel, we lost to a motorbike accident in 2009, somewhere on a stretch of road outside Featherston. He was 22. After that, Maggie and I held on to each other the way 2 people hold on to a single umbrella in a downpour. We weren't always warm, but we were close. Or so I thought. I retired from surveying 4 years ago. We had a bit put away, a small farmlet with a few sheep on it, and a life insurance policy worth $620,000 that I'd been paying into since the late 80s. The premium ate into our budget more than once. Maggie used to grumble about it. I always told her the same thing. If something happens to me, you won't be on your own. That's all I want. And she would soften and say I was being morbid, and the conversation would end with a kiss on the forehead. That phrase, "if something happens to me," used to be hypothetical. Then last year, around the start of winter, it stopped being. It began with a phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear. I'd been outside, fixing the gate latch on the back paddock. The wind had blown it loose again. I came in through the laundry, my boots still on, and I heard Maggie in the kitchen on the landline. She didn't hear me. The dog did, but the dog never says anything. She was talking to her brother, my brother-in-law, Trevor Halloran. Trevor was 3 years younger than her, lived up in Hamilton, ran a small contracting business that always seemed to be one bad invoice away from collapse. He'd asked us for money twice over the years. The first time I gave it. The second time I said no. And Maggie didn't speak to me properly for a fortnight. What I heard her say on that phone, with her back to the doorway and her voice low and certain, was this: "It's nearly sorted, Trev. Once Edmund's name is off the policy and yours is on, it's just a matter of waiting. The doctor said his heart's not what it should be. We just have to be patient." I stood there in my socks. The boots were still in the laundry. My hand was on the doorframe, and the doorframe felt very far away from the rest of me. She kept talking. Something about a solicitor in Palmerston North who didn't ask questions. Something about Trevor needing his cut soon because the bank was breathing down his neck. Something about how I'd never checked the paperwork because I trusted her. And that was the beautiful part of it, she said. The beautiful part. That's the phrase she used. I don't remember walking back out to the paddock. I remember standing by the gate with my hand on the wire and watching the sheep move slowly across the slope and thinking that I had become a stranger inside my own life without anyone telling me. That night I cooked dinner, the way I did every Wednesday. Lamb chops, mash, peas. I poured her a glass of wine. She kissed my cheek and said I was a good husband. I smiled, and I asked her how her day had been, and she told me it had been quiet, just a bit of housework. A call to her brother, she said, almost as an afterthought. He was thinking of coming down to visit. That'd be lovely, I said. I went to bed at 10 and lay awake until 3. My wife slept beside me with her hand on my arm, the way she always did. And I kept thinking about the phrase she had used. The beautiful part. The beautiful part of murdering me slowly was that I trusted her. I didn't sleep for 2 more nights. On the 3rd morning, I drove into Masterton and walked into a solicitor's office I'd never been to before. A woman called Helena Pritchard. She had gray hair pulled back and reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of calm voice that made you feel like the world wasn't ending, even when it was. I told her everything. Word for word. The phone call. The brother. The doctor's appointment from 6 months earlier where my GP had mentioned a slight irregularity in my heart rhythm. Nothing urgent, just something to monitor. I told her about the policy. About Maggie being the sole beneficiary, about how Trevor had access to our home whenever he visited, and how Maggie did most of the cooking. Helena Pritchard listened without writing anything down for the first 10 minutes. Then she asked me one question. "Mr. Whitcombe, do you have any evidence of what you heard?" I said no. "Just my word against my wife's." "Then we don't go to the police yet," she said. "Not because they wouldn't believe you, but because if you accuse her now, she'll deny it, and you'll have shown your hand. We do something quieter first." I asked her what. She said, "We change the beneficiary, and we wait." I want to stop here for a moment, because I know some of you are already shouting at the screen. Why didn't I confront her? Why didn't I leave? Why didn't I call the police that very afternoon? I'll tell you why. Because 39 years is a long time to stop believing in someone. Part of me was still hoping I'd misheard. Part of me was hoping there was an explanation. And the smaller, harder part of me, the part that had buried a son and held its tongue through more grief than I'll ever describe to a stranger, that part wanted to know for certain. Not suspect. No. So I did what Helena told me to do. I drove home that afternoon with the paperwork in a folder under the passenger seat. I parked the ute, walked inside, kissed my wife on the top of her head, and told her I'd been at the hardware store. She didn't ask any more than that. She never did. Over the next 10 days, I changed the beneficiary on the policy. I removed Margaret Whitcombe. I did not put my son Lewis on it, because Lewis would have asked questions. And Lewis is the worst liar in the family. I did not put a charity on it either, although Helena suggested it. I had something else in mind. I named the new beneficiary the Daniel Whitcombe Trades Apprenticeship Foundation, a trust I set up in my dead son's name. The trust would fund apprenticeships for young men and women in the Wairarapa who couldn't afford the tools or the course fees to start a trade. Daniel had wanted to be an electrician before he died. He never got the chance. I thought about that every day for 16 years, and I'd never done a thing about it. Now I had a reason to. Helena drew up the trust documents. The trustees were her, my old mate Brian, who I'd surveyed with for 30 years, and Lewis, although Lewis didn't know yet. The whole thing took 11 days. On the 12th day I drove home, made a cup of tea, sat down across from my wife, and waited. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell anyone. I just waited. A month passed, then another. Trevor came down for a visit, just as Maggie had said he would. He stayed 3 nights. He was warm and friendly, and asked me about the sheep and complimented the lamb chops. At one point, when Maggie was outside, he looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "You're looking tired, mate. You taking care of yourself?" I said I was. He nodded slowly and said, "Good. That's good. Family's everything, Ed." I almost laughed in his face, but I didn't. I smiled, and I poured him another beer. In the 3rd month I started to feel unwell. Not very, just a bit off. Tired in the afternoons. A strange metallic taste in my mouth sometimes, especially after dinner. My GP, a young woman named Dr. Moana Ratapu in Greytown, ran some bloods. Nothing alarming, she said. But she frowned at one of the readings. She asked me what I'd been eating. She asked if I was taking any new medications. She asked, almost as an afterthought, if anyone else in the house was preparing my food. I said my wife did most of the cooking. Dr. Ratapu looked at me a long moment. She said, "Edmund, I don't want to alarm you, but I'd like you to come back next week, and we'll do another panel. And in the meantime, would you mind eating out for a few days? Or cooking your own meals?" I said I'd think about it. That night I went home, and I made my own dinner for the first time in 39 years. Maggie was hurt. She asked what was wrong. I said I just felt like cooking for her for a change. She accepted that. She always did. A week later, the second blood panel came back. Dr. Ratapu rang me herself, on my mobile, while I was out in the back paddock checking on a ewe with a sore hoof. She said, "Edmund, I need you to come in today. Not tomorrow. Today. And I need you to bring whatever's in your medicine cabinet. And, if it's not too much trouble, anything in your fridge that you didn't buy yourself." I sat down on a stump. The ewe limped past me. I told the doctor I'd be there in an hour. I went home first. Maggie was at her sister's place in Carterton for the afternoon. I took 2 glass jars from the kitchen, one of jam and one of a homemade chutney she'd made the week before. I took a small packet of what looked like vitamin tablets that had appeared on my bedside table about 2 months earlier, which Maggie had told me were just a magnesium supplement she thought I should try. I took a half-full bottle of the brandy. I had a small glass of every Sunday night because she'd said it was good for the heart. I drove to Dr. Ratapu's surgery. I gave her everything. She didn't ask questions. She just bagged it all up and said she was sending it to a lab in Wellington, the kind of lab that does work for the police, although she didn't put it that way. 3 weeks later, the results came back. The vitamin tablets contained a low dose of digoxin, a heart medication, useful in small amounts, fatal in larger ones, especially over time, especially in a man with an existing irregularity. The brandy had traces of the same. The jam and the chutney were clean. So was everything else in the fridge. Dr. Ratapu sat across from me in her small consulting room and she said, very quietly, "Edmund, I'm going to give you the name of a detective sergeant in Masterton. I'd like you to call him today." I said I would, but I didn't. Not yet, because I'd been thinking, in those 3 weeks of waiting for the lab results, about what I really wanted. And what I wanted wasn't only justice. It was something else. Something harder to name. I wanted my wife to look me in the eye and tell me what she had done. I wanted her to hand me the cup, and I wanted to set it down on the table. And I wanted her to know, in that moment, that I knew. So I called Helena Pritchard instead. I told her what the lab had found. She went very quiet. The way a person goes quiet when something that was theoretical becomes real. Then she said, "Edmund, you have to go to the police. Today. I'm sorry. There's no other way." I said, "Helena, just let me have one evening. Just one. Then I'll do whatever you say." She told me later she shouldn't have agreed. But she did. That evening, I drove home. Maggie was in the kitchen. She had laid the table for 2. There was a candle, which was unusual. She said she'd missed me and wanted to do something nice. She poured me a small glass of brandy and handed it to me, and she smiled the smile I'd loved for 39 years. I took the glass. I held it in my hand. I looked at her, and I said, "Maggie, I know." She didn't move. The smile didn't drop. It just froze, like a photograph of a smile. "You know what, love?" she said eventually. I set the glass down on the table. I said, "I know about the policy. I know about Trevor. I know about the tablets you've been giving me. I know about everything." Now the smile broke. I'd expected her to deny it. I'd expected her to cry, to scream, to throw something. Instead, she sat down very slowly in her chair, and she put her hands flat on the table, and she said, in a voice so calm it frightened me, How long have you known? I said. Long enough. She nodded. She stared at the candle. She said, I didn't think you'd notice. I said, I noticed when you said it was the beautiful part. She closed her eyes. Then, and this is the part I still don't understand, she said, I'm tired, Edmund. I've been tired for a long time. I thought if I had the money, I could just go somewhere warm, be on my own. Trevor said he'd help me set it up. I didn't want to hurt you. I just wanted a different life. I said, Maggie, you were poisoning me, she said. Slowly. I wasn't trying to kill you. I just wanted you to slow down, to get sick, to need looking after, and then I'd be the grieving widow. And no one would ask questions, and I could finally rest. I asked her if she heard herself. She didn't answer. I told her I had changed the beneficiary 5 months ago. I told her the policy now belonged to a trust in Daniel's name. I told her there was no money waiting for her, or for Trevor. And there never had been, not since the start of winter. I told her the police already had the lab results, and that I was going to the station in the morning, and that she had until then to call her sister and arrange somewhere to stay, because I was not sleeping under the same roof as her again. She looked at me with something I can only describe as relief. As if the worst part for her had been the carrying of it, not the doing. She said, Daniel would have hated me for this. I said, Daniel would have hated both of us for 100 reasons. But yes, he would have. I left the house that night, and I drove to Lewis's place in Wellington. I sat in his lounge, and I told my son everything, from the phone call to the lab results to the candle on the table. He didn't say a word for almost an hour. Then he stood up and he hugged me, and he said, Dad, why didn't you ring me? I said, because I didn't want you to lose your mother before you had to. He cried then. So did I. The next morning I went to the police station in Masterton with Helena Pritchard beside me. I gave a statement that took 4 hours. They arrested Maggie that afternoon at her sister's house. Trevor was picked up the day after, in Hamilton, in his car park, on his way to a job. He tried to say he hadn't known what she was doing. The phone records told a different story. The trial took 11 months to come around. Maggie pleaded guilty. Trevor didn't, but the jury saw through him in less than a day. She got 6 years. He got 9. I haven't seen either of them since the sentencing. Although Lewis tells me his mother writes to him occasionally, and that he doesn't know what to do with the letters. I told him he doesn't have to do anything. He can put them in a drawer until he's ready, or he can put them in a fire. Either way, he doesn't owe anyone an answer. The Daniel Whitcombe Trades Apprenticeship Foundation gave out its first 3 scholarships this past March. One to a young woman in Featherston who wanted to be a builder. One to a lad from Martinborough who'd been turned down for an electrical apprenticeship because he couldn't afford the gear. One to a Maori boy from Masterton whose mother had raised him on her own and who wanted to be a diesel mechanic. I went to the small ceremony at the local trades training center. I shook each of their hands. I told them my son's name had been Daniel, and that he would have liked all 3 of them very much. I still live in the same weatherboard house. The wind still blows the gate latch loose. The dog has gotten older, and so have I. Lewis comes down most weekends. Sometimes he brings a woman he's been seeing, a pediatric nurse named Aroha, and I like her very much. The house is quieter than it used to be, but it's a different kind of quiet, the kind you can rest in instead of the kind you brace against. I want to leave you with a few things. Not advice, exactly. Just what an old man learned. The hard and slow way. If someone you love has access to your money, your medicine, and your meals, that is a great deal of trust to place in a single set of hands. Most of the time, that trust is held well. But check your paperwork once a year. Know who your beneficiaries are. Know who has power of attorney. Know which solicitor holds your will and when it was last updated. These aren't morbid questions. They're the same kind of question you ask about your roof or your tires. Maintenance. If something feels wrong in your home, listen to it. Not the loud feelings, the small ones, the metallic taste, the phone call you weren't supposed to hear, the way someone looks at you when they think you're not looking back. We are taught from childhood not to make a fuss, especially men of my generation. But making a fuss has saved more lives than keeping the peace ever has. Talk to your doctor. Not just about your knees, about your life. Mine asked me one question, almost in passing, that started the whole rescue. Doctors are not just there for the body. They notice things. Let them. And finally, forgiveness is yours, to give or to keep. Don't let anyone tell you that forgiving is the strong thing or the weak thing. Sometimes it's the right thing, and sometimes it isn't. And only you know which. I haven't forgiven Maggie. I might one day, and I might not. What I have done is refuse to let what she tried to do be the last chapter of my life. The last chapter is mine to write. The trust, the boys at the training center, the cup of tea I make myself every morning on a kitchen bench, I now own outright. That's my last chapter. Not hers. The coffee, by the way, tastes better than it did a year ago. I make it myself now. I take it on the back porch, and I watch the sheep move across the slope, and I think about my son and about the boys and girls in the Wairarapa who'll get to swing a hammer or wire a house because of him. That's the kind of justice I was after. Not loud, not bloody, just right. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me about a time you had to choose between keeping the peace and telling the truth. I read everyone. I might not reply quickly because I'm not as fast on the keyboard as I used to be. But I read them. And subscribe to Hollow Tales if you haven't already. There are more stories where this came from. Some of them are mine. Some of them belong to people I've met along the way. All of them are about ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary corners and what they chose to do when no one was watching. Take care of yourselves out there. Check the locks. Check the paperwork. And be good to the ones who are good to you, because they are rarer than you think and more precious than they know. I'm Edmund Whitcombe. Good night from Greytown.